The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, a fantastic investigation of the nature of evil and good, human frailty, and the power of God. Listen now as we chronicle a handful of different ways that C.S. Lewis predicted the vices and predations of our modern culture. There are a bunch of large-scale arguments that Lewis makes in the Screwtape Letters. The first one is that Satan's best weapon is the quote-unquote real world. And this is right. I mean, if you talk to people who are secular, they'll always say that the spiritual world, God, is unreal. The real world is the material world. And then, when you ask them about what's important to them, they'll talk about their feelings, which of course are inherently unreal in the same way the spiritual world is unreal. This is a point that Lewis makes. The definition of real is capacious and changing on a regular basis from secularists. So Lewis believes that man's draw to the divine can be rooted in reason, and that reason actually guides you towards something beyond yourself. It guides you toward the transcendent. That's an idea that I obviously agree with. I believe that the notion of free will, free choice in the universe, guides you toward the idea of there must be something beyond us, that if there's a logic to the universe that guides you to the question of who is the chief logician, who made the rules, for example. Lewis makes the same point, and then he says that the job of the secular materialist is to get you to focus on the thing, to get you to focus on the thing in itself. That's sort of the language of Bertrand Russell, famous atheist. And so Lewis says this: even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, this is a Screwtape as Screwtape. You will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream, teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. Right, so just keep them focused on the immediate, focused on the now. There's nothing that's done that's more than the internet age, where our attention spans have been reduced to the next 15 seconds. Sitting and ruminating on life leads you to higher ideas. If you can prevent people from doing that sort of stuff, you end up with a very materialistic society. So what exactly does reality mean? Well, according to Screwtape, people ought to be taught that in all experiences which can make them happier or better, only the physical facts are real, while the spiritual elements are subjective. And in all experiences which can discourage or corrupt them, the spiritual elements are the main reality, and to ignore them is to be an escapist. Right, so the idea is that when you're thinking about death, that the only thing that is real is the death. You're not supposed to look to the spiritual element of death. Or if you look at something that makes you very happy, you're not supposed to look to the spiritual element of what makes you very happy. Just focus in on the pure materialism of the thing. And the goal is to enmesh mankind in the world, and this is something that Catholic theologians talk about a lot. The idea that the spiritual world, if you can enmesh it in reality too much, then you can bring people away from the reality of something higher. This means, for example, that you have to get people to stop thinking about death. Screwtape says, how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death with which war enforces. One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless in wartime. Not even a human can believe that he is going to live forever. The material world, then, is the chief ally of Screwtape, because people desire not to think of God. God is a distraction, God has obligations, God has duties. Screwtape says human beings hate every idea that suggests him, just as men in financial embarrassment hate the very sight of a passbook. Passbook meaning like a checkbook. So the idea is that if you're not thinking about duty, and then you're forced to think about duty, you don't like it very much. The other thing that Screwtape tries to get you to focus in on is the future at all times. If you can focus in on the future at all times, then people will be very neglectful of the present. So, says Screwtape, it's far better to make them live in the future. The future is of all things the thing least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time, for the past is frozen. It no longer flows. The present is all lit up with eternal rays. Hence the encouragement we have given to all those schemes of thought, like creative evolution, scientific humanism, or communism, which fix men's affections on the future, on the very core of temporality. Hence, nearly all vices are rooted in the future. The idea is if you're thinking about the future, then you're not thinking about the spiritual consequences of the things you do in the here and now. You're thinking about the material consequences of the things that you do in the here and now. And that allows you to do bad things in the name of a quote-unquote better future. Screwtape says the best thing you can do is convince people that their utopian thoughts are the things that are mandated by God. So on the one hand, you try to get people sunk in reality, and this drives them away from God. On the other hand, Screwtape advises Wormwood that people should be led to examine their own emotions constantly. Like if you can be narcissistically checking yourself all the time, you're going to end up without God. So if you feel wildly enthusiastic about becoming religious, then Wormwood ought to encourage people to wait for the anti-climax, right? Because you get enthusiastic about, I think I'm less enthusiastic about the thing, and then you pounce, quote, work hard then on the disappointment or anti-climax which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. In every department of life, it marks the transition from dreaming aspiration to laborious doing. The enemy takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses. So in other words, very often in life we engage at the beginning of a task with great enthusiasm, and then the enthusiasm wears away. This happens all the time with a variety of tasks, and once that happens, that is when you encourage people to look into being morose, look into being depressed, to reject the spiritual aspect of their duty, to stop trying to take joy in the spiritual aspect of what they're doing, and instead focus in on the fact that it's just sheer drudgery. So for example, when it comes to prayer, human beings should be encouraged to seek a feeling of inspiration, specifically because it's very hard to find. I mean, I pray 3 times a day. I've talked about this before. Finding a feeling of inspiration while you're praying can be really, really difficult. And so if you're constantly searching your feelings, I'm not inspired enough, I'm not inspired, eventually, like I'm never getting inspired, you stop doing it. And that's the goal, whereas the reality is that when you're praying, you should stop searching inside your own feelings all the time. You should focus on the doing of the prayer, and then when eventually you stumble onto the feeling, it's an incredible thing. But at least you won't stop doing the thing when you lose the feeling. So you focus in on the feeling. When the feeling goes short, you stop doing the duty. If you focus in on the duty, then eventually you come to feeling is the case that Lewis is actually making. Screwtape says that the rule of thumb for leading mankind away from God is to encourage people to be unself-conscious when considering sin. It's about being unabashed, unashamed, very just out there, and blasé about your sin. But to be self-conscious and awkward when you consider acts of faith. This is modern society in a nutshell. The more you sin, the more proud you should be. You should engage in full-on festivals celebrating your sin. When it comes to going to church, you'll be shy. I don't want to be judgmental and I'll make you feel ashamed. I don't want to make you feel bad about the fact that I go to synagogue on a routine basis, and I know my yarmulke makes you feel uncomfortable as a Jew, because it might make you think that you're not being religious enough. But when it comes to my sin, man, I will tell you about my sins all day long because we can all be comfortable. We can be the boys when we're talking about our sins. Other roads to hell include depression and anxiety. Screwtape says when people are depressed, they're more likely to despair that their actions and thoughts even matter, and so they sort of sink into a malaise. This leads you to what C.S. Lewis calls grayness. If you're passionate about things, then very often you can find spirituality, but if you're gray about things, it's very hard to find spirituality. He says, the Christians describe the enemy as one without whom nothing is strong, and nothing is very strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and knows not why, in the gratification of curiosity so feeble that man is only half aware of them. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Is this a great description of the internet age or what? You spend all day on social media, consuming your time with absolute stupidities. You don't feel anything good about it. It just feels like, and then, when you go outside in the sun, you still feel unenthusiastic. The goal of modern society is almost solely, apparently, to do the work of Wormwood here. The point that Lewis makes is that you're able to get at people through art, through popular culture. He says, "We've engineered a great increase in the license which society allows to the representation of the apparent nude in art and its exhibition on the stage of the bathing beach." It's all fake, of course. The figures in the popular art are falsely drawn. The real women in bathing suits or tights are actually pinched in and propped up to make them appear firmer and more slender and more boyish than nature allows a full-grown woman to be. Yet at the same time, the modern world is taught to believe that it is being frank and healthy and getting back to nature. As a result, we are more and more directing the desires of men to something which does not exist, making the role of the eye in sexuality more and more important, and at the same time making its demands more and more impossible. What follows you can easily forecast. That is the greatest description of internet porn that has ever been written, and C.S. Lewis is writing this in 1942, right? That you're setting up increasing expectations for what women are supposed to look like, what sex is supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, and then people are engaging in it less and less. You're making demands nearly impossible, and yet you are satisfying those demands with the virtual. And that again, C.S. Lewis, a man ahead of his time, because here's the thing, sin is always the same. This is the thing that people always say about the Bible, and it's so stupid. They'll say, "Oh, the Bible, it's archaic. The Bible's talking about things that have changed." You know what has never changed? Human nature. C.S. Lewis could have written this 4,000 years ago. It would not have mattered. Human nature does not change. Human nature is the same as it was thousands of years ago. The only thing that has changed is that we believe that we have been able to overcome human nature, which of course is extraordinary arrogance and silliness. It turns out that all of the systems that we built to hem in human nature, all the systems that we built in order to channel human nature to its best available pursuits, we've exploded all of those in the belief that we have created a new human already. Now, there are a lot of ideologies that say that you can create a new human. Marxism says you can create a new human. Change the economic conditions, change the man. Secular humanism says the same thing, that if you just get rid of God, then magically a new human being will flourish. Religion says no. Human beings are exactly the same as they were when Adam ate the apple with Eve in the garden. We're exactly the same, and nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is that we've built institutions and systems in order to channel us toward our better selves. And when you blow up all those institutions, what you end up with is something very, very bad, which is precisely what has happened. Screwtape also talks about how human relationships can undermine faith as well, because human beings have a really tough time living with each other. And so most sin is not between man and God. Most sin is between man and man. When he talks about the relations in marriage, for example, Lewis is right on the money. He says, "In civilized life, domestic hatred usually expresses itself by saying things which would appear quite harmless on paper. The words are not offensive, but in such a voice or at such a moment that they're not far short of a blow in the face. Your patient must demand that all his own utterances are to be taken at face value and judged simply on the actual words, while at the same time judging all his mother's utterances with the fullest and most oversensitive interpretation of the tone, the context, and the suspected intention. This is true in virtually all human relationships, right? You say something and you say it in kind of a nasty way, and then when somebody gets offended, you're like, "Hey, what did I say? What did I do? Did I say no? I just lit, and I'll read back the words that I said." It's like, well, no, the tone mattered an awful lot right there. By the way, this is one of the reasons why, just a piece of Shapiro advice here, try to have as many conversations via voice as you can, and not via text. Text is open to misinterpretation. Voice really is not. But we do have a double standard. We insist that everybody interpret us in the best light, and then we interpret everybody else in the worst possible light. And then his descriptions of men and women are also extraordinarily accurate. This is one of my favorite sections of the book. He says, "A woman means by unselfishness chiefly taking trouble for others. A man means not giving trouble to others, As a result, a woman who is quite far gone in the enemy's service will make a nuisance of herself on a larger scale than any man, except those whom our Father has dominated completely. And conversely, a man will live long in the enemy's camp before he undertakes as much spontaneous work to please others as a quite ordinary woman may do every day. In other words, women tend to be very helpful, and if Satan can get a hold of them, then intrusive and invasive. And men tend to be very blasé, which means that they allow people their space, but also if Satan gets a hold of them, then they are completely disconnected from other human beings and selfish. A sensible human once said, "If people knew how much ill-feeling unselfishness occasions, it would not be so," often recommended from the pulpit. And again, she's the sort of woman who lives for others. You can always tell the others by their hunted expression. Screwtape discusses with Wormwood the misinterpretation of the word love, how it has come to mean sexual desire, and the shift from marriage as a duty-based relationship to a voluntary one. He says, in humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse, for the members are more distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them, which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and if obediently entered into, too often will produce affection in the family. Humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy. He explains how the devil can reduce family to a subjective feeling of love, resulting in the loss of duty when love fades. This has led to the slogan, "Love is love," a definition of marriage without boundaries, which could include bigamy, polygamy, or even incest. He argues that love traditionally meant duty and familial relations, and redefining it as a subjective feeling robs marriage of its identity. Screwtape also mentions that one way to hell is to ignore the individual human beings in favor of mankind writ large, a tactic of the left to pursue a better world for everybody at the expense of the neighbors. He states, "The great thing is to direct the malice of his immediate neighbors, whom he meets every day, and to thrust his benevolence out to the remote circumference to people he doesn't know. The malice thus becomes wholly real, and the benevolence largely imagined." He talks about the human incapacity to understand the divine, highlighting that God limits his power in our lives to allow free will. This creates a gap between humans and the divine, leading to misconceptions about God. He notes, one of the big questions that you're supposed to not ask is really the nature of God, because you're not really able to comprehend God. Finally, Screwtape discusses the notion of complete human autonomy apart from God as ridiculous. He points out the modern resistance to chastity stems from men's belief that they own their bodies. He says, those vast and perilous estates pulsating with the energy that made the world, in which they find themselves without their consent, and from which they are ejected at the pleasure of another. The notion of complete bodily autonomy may be true from other human beings, but it is not true in terms of godly duty.